Good evening. Thank you for your invitation and your hospitality. And please accept my condolences on the loss in your royal family. I was very sorry to hear the news. This evening, I would like to share with you some reflections that have been percolating in my mind since I finished my book. So I will summarize a couple of the most important points, most important conclusions of my study, and then go on to talk about their possible implications beyond the Silk Road and One Belt, One Road issue, and talk a bit more about global politics, about global civil society, and about problems involved in reforming and reinventing democracy. So you see that my initial thinking about China and its relationship with the Islamic world has led me into some unanticipated directions. And I'll try this evening to give you some idea of how my thinking developed in this particular direction. Let me begin by explaining briefly the effort in my most recent book. It's called China and the Islamic World: How the New Silk Road is Transforming Global Politics. It's an expansive title. It covers a lot of issues, and the text itself is, I believe, under 200 pages. So you'll see that it's quite broad and theoretical, but there's also a good deal of empirical evidence. The New Silk Road in Chinese is usually called One Belt, One Road, Idai Ilu, and it refers to this very ambitious network of infrastructure and trading routes that cover the entire Eastern Hemisphere, what we would call Eurasia and Africa. And more recently, it extends as well into South America and northward into the Arctic Circle. As global warming opens up the Arctic passages, this also has been incorporated into the larger thinking of the New Silk Road. The most important discoveries for me in this project were that China itself, the Chinese leaders, were thoroughly unprepared for the consequences of their very bold and ambitious thinking. And that it is very unlikely that China will be able to manage or in any way control the New Silk Road once it is built. And the Chinese thinking about this new era of connectivity has been largely in terms of hardware, of concrete and steel and dams and railroads, but not nearly as much in terms of emotions and of aspirations and of culture and of the psychological and political and social dimension of connectivity and changing international relationships in a fundamental way. The Chinese vision in the New Silk Road is transoceanic, transcontinental, it's hemispheric, and interhemispheric. But much of the introduction and overview of these plans is presented in this kind of geographic, distant and impersonal way, maps with roots, but not very much faces of people who are the most affected and most interested. And the diversity of those faces in terms of nationality, ethnicity, class, educational level, and political aspiration. Most importantly, I think that the Chinese leaders have underestimated the degree to which the world is already connected, especially the Islamic world. Connected not simply in terms of bullet trains and oceanic shipping passages and deep sea ports, but connected in terms of religious and national identity, in terms of ethnic background, in terms of organizational connections in society, political, including political parties, especially in formal democracies, interest groups, associations of all kinds, both rural and urban. So when China set about studying and planning for and then executing this ambitious project, they viewed it primarily as a matter of dealing with government elites and making agreements in private that would then be disclosed at the convenience of the elites involved and would be accepted and pretty much a fait accompli by the societies in question. This was an enormous surprise for Chinese leaders to discover that the people in countries like Indonesia, Nigeria, Turkey, Pakistan, Iran, Egypt, and many others. But I mentioned these countries, which are the backbone of the New Silk Road and the heartlands of the contemporary Islamic world and of contemporary Islamic civilization. The Chinese, I think, were quite astounded to discover that these people had ideas of their own, that they had expectations and demands from their governments, and that they were quite happy to have foreign involvement and insistence, but they wanted to have input. They wanted to have veto power. They wanted to have the ultimate authority to approve or disapprove of anything that involved use of their national territory, use of their natural resources. And the Chinese leaders, I think, were also quite surprised to learn that people in these societies were very quick to learn what was happening, even when the governments involved were not interested in publicizing the details, and that they quickly responded, often in critical and negative and protesting behavior, in ways that forced the national governments to go back and renegotiate many of the details and to disclose many of the financial and environmental and human rights and labor implications of these agreements. In country after country, Chinese leaders have discovered that the world is already wired and that it is quite woke. In in the US, we use this word woke to mean what we used to mean by awakened. That is to say that people are alert, that they're paying attention, they know what's going on, and they're not going to have the wool pulled over their eyes, that they don't take their leader's word for granted, and that they want an open disclosure and direct participation in all decisions. To their credit, Chinese leaders have rather quickly adapted to these discoveries. And there's no question that there's an important learning process occurring. Political learning is a fascinating topic. It's a sort of central part of all statecraft and studies of diplomacy. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of political learning is how rare it is and how slow it arises. That is to say that people in power are very commonly quite sure of themselves and relatively uninterested in what others have to say about their ideas. And that they have, in other words, a number of blind spots, some of which are intentional and self-imposed, and breaking through those blind spots, overcoming them, is quite difficult. In China, this is true as well. So there is no reason to assume that there would be a rapid learning curve among Chinese diplomats and Chinese political leaders concerning their relations with the Islamic world. Nonetheless, it's happened in country after country. Chinese leaders have become more astute, more attentive, more sympathetic, more willing to bargain, more willing to negotiate and listen, more willing to reach beyond backroom deals with elite bankers and politicians and address the general public, especially opposition parties, interest group leaders, opposition leaders, and even separatist movements in countries like Pakistan and Nigeria. The second discovery that struck me from this study is that the learning process of Chinese leaders is extremely selective and incomplete. It stops at the border and does not extend to China itself. It does not extend to their own people. So ironically, the more willing Chinese leaders are to become open-minded and forthcoming in their relationship with foreigners, especially with well-organized nationalist and political groups in the key countries in the Islamic world that make up the backbone of the New Silk Road, they are less willing, year by year, to extend the same consideration to their own people. And what one sees in China over a very short period of 5 years or so is a rapid regression in virtually every aspect of political expression, and a tightening of political control, a lack of tolerance for anything resembling dissent, and an enormous increase in suspicion, not only of known dissidents or of potential troublemakers like university students or intellectuals, but party members themselves. so that the more the central party leadership tries to tighten control, the more suspicious it becomes of its own party members and junior leaders. Every few years, the Chinese Communist Party passes new regulations making it more difficult for party members to gather spontaneously or privately without advance formal permission. This has occurred again recently, and there is now an order in place instructing party members. These, of course, are the loyalists. These are the people who are the pillars of the regime and supposedly the inheritors of power in the future. Instructing party members that if three or more meet privately without advance permission, their intentions will be considered suspicious, which is a bureaucratic way of saying you will be invited for an extended conversation with security officials. And one thing you have to remember about people in the Chinese Communist Party is that although from the outside they look very powerful and well-connected and extremely privileged, the fact is that they are the most vulnerable people in the country because they have no rights. Well, you'll say nobody in China has any rights. Well, that's not quite true. And as someone who trained a number of Chinese lawyers for 3 years, I can tell you that China is filled with lawyers who take the Constitution seriously and justice seriously and due process seriously. But when I asked my law students in China if they had given any thought to the possibility of developing a practice in defending party members who had gotten into disciplinary trouble, they laughed at me. And they said, "You poor man, you have no idea of the reality in our country." And I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "Party members are not entitled to legal representation. They can't hire us if they want to." And I said, "Well, then who represents them?" They said, "No one." They are entirely vulnerable and subject to party rules and party disciplinary bodies and party disciplinary procedures. So the reason I'm spelling this out for you is so that you'll understand the complete contradiction between the evident learning process, as reluctant as it is, as belated as it is, as half-hearted as it may be, in dealing with foreign countries, versus the heavy-handed and increasingly myopic approach to dealing with the Chinese public. There's a further complication, and that is that the New Silk Road is a two-way street. Now, we know it's a two-way street because the people involved are speaking back to their governments, and the governments are then speaking back to the Chinese leadership. But it goes further than that. And all of these events and debates and controversies are seeping into the consciousness of the Chinese public, so that when Chinese leaders negotiate and compromise with labor movements, with environmental rights activists, with human rights organizations in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, the Chinese public learns of this, and many people ask themselves, why are our leaders so willing to be solicitous and compromising with foreigners, but not with us? This contradiction is open, it's glaring, and it's very difficult to imagine that it will sustain itself for very long. So, where do I go from those conclusions into thinking anew about international relations and about the organization of protest and independent action throughout the Islamic world and throughout the third world in general, and in my own country, and about the problems of legitimacy and authority in democratic countries. Well, to begin with, the title tells you that I'm thinking in terms of collisions of semi-great powers. And you've probably all heard a great deal of discussion about great powers, especially from my colleagues in political science and international law. It's a kind of staple of our craft to examine the great powers of the day and how they rise and fall in history. Well, after examining China, I've come to the conclusion that China is not a great power, and that the longer one lives in the United States, the longer one realizes that the United States is not a great power. And anybody who's lived in the Islamic world for any period of time understands that there are countless would-be great powers or regional great powers, but none of them, individually or collectively, is going to solve many problems or be in a position to coordinate decisive action. So it's very plain to me that we are in a very difficult, tenuous situation where there are no possibilities of world hegemony or even of a concert of semi-great powers who would be willing to cooperate in any long-term or systematic manner in order to provide global governance. What we used to expect from the United Nations and international organizations and international regimes. So if I look back at the study of international relations for most of the post-World War II period, it's the study of liberal institutionalism, global governance, international law, international regimes. If we look back at the study of international relations since, the fall of the Soviet Union or since 9/11 attacks in the United States, it's all about a unipolar world in which the United States has sole dominance and full spectrum control. And what I'm suggesting is that neither of those situations is satisfying as an explanation to me, neither of those models. And while most of my colleagues in international relations are convinced that we are in an era of declining institutionalization, declining global governance, and rising power politics, rising realism, I think that we are in neither of those situations, that there has been no breakthrough to a new equilibrium or collective committee that could manage international affairs. We like to think in terms of systems that are stable, that are disrupted, that break down, or that regain some kind of equilibrium and put themselves back in order again. These are the dominant concepts and paradigms and underlying assumptions in social science. And many of them are borrowed directly and intentionally from the life sciences and from information technology and from the natural sciences. So any of you who are familiar with approaches such as complex adaptive systems or systems of chaos will be familiar with these efforts to update and improve the old systems models of input-output feedback as though everything is like a thermostat. But what I'm suggesting is that what I'm seeing in today's international environment, especially when I look at critical parts of it, including China and China's relationship with the Islamic world, what I'm seeing is that there is no positive, emergent response to the multitude of disruptions that we are experiencing. Nor is there a clear collapse in sight or restoration of some equilibrium on a new basis. Instead, what I'm seeing is a great deal of teetering or hovering at a brink. We're not reaching any tipping point that pushes us into a new direction decisively so that we know that the last 3 or 4 alternatives are no longer viable. Rather, we're in a very confusing and tense period of wondering what's going to happen and realizing that there is no leader to follow and there is no pack or gang to follow. China can't run the world. The United States can't run the world. They can't run the world together. And there's no coalition that they could put together that would run the world. And a lot of the thinking about the New Silk Road involves the question of whether the Islamic world can be enlisted as an influential and reliable ally of China in the future. Or alternatively, whether the United States should, and Western Europe, take action to frustrate and prevent that kind of coalescence. One of the debates in the United States about responding to the New Silk Road is, well, should we ignore it as a pipe dream, as something that has no practical possibilities? Should we let the Chinese acquire enough rope to hang themselves with these white elephant projects that will drain them? In other words, will the New Silk Road be the arms race for China, as the bankrupting splurge that the arms race was for the Soviet Union? Another view is that the United States can't afford to be so passive, that if China is going to become an increasingly equal and contentious rival, and if the Islamic world is in play, and if China has certain advantages in the Islamic world that the West doesn't, after a couple of centuries of imperialism and neo-imperialism and proxy wars and so on, then maybe the United States has to be more assertive. And we have to be vigilant about frustrating and blocking and preventing the Chinese effort to integrate Eurasia, to integrate the Eastern Hemisphere, and to extend that influence into the Western Hemisphere through South America. So I'm trying to give you an idea of the geopolitical chess that lies behind the thinking of the major planners and political figures, not just in Beijing, but in Washington as well. And I'm suggesting that they'll have it wrong because they have an exaggerated view of their own importance, their own ability to control, and they vastly underestimate risk. And most of all, they underestimate the independence, the intelligence, the sophistication, the determination of people in the Islamic world, especially young people who are more educated and well-traveled and better informed than ever, and who are completely fed up with authority of all sorts, whether it is political or family or religious or generational or gender-based authority. So, in terms of international politics, when we have this kind of multiplicity of actors and decentralized decision-making, what can we expect? Well, I think we have to expect enormous uncertainty and mistrust, so that the idea that any of the would-be great powers or semi-great powers will be able to fashion long-term comprehensive agreements, anything like alliances, is far-fetched. And that instead we should expect to see, and in fact we already are seeing, the withering of existing alliances and their replacement not by new alliances, but by tentative explorations, and some people call it quasi-alliances. One of my colleagues in Shanghai has just written a book about quasi-alliances. The problems of American diplomacy are very much a matter of nostalgia in trying to revive the North Atlantic Alliance, the centrality of NATO, of the Bretton Woods financial institutions. And there's enormous frustration in the United States, especially in the Beltway, in the decision-making arena, foreign policy community. Enormous frustration with countries like France and Germany and Britain who don't pay their way, but I imagine the frustration with Turkey. Our great ally, Turkey, who has abandoned the Kurds, our other great ally. So the Turks are a great ally, but we can't stand them, and the Kurds are our great ally, newfound, but we can do without them. Both Turkey and the Kurdish leadership in Syria have bounced back quite well and know what their options are and are ready to deal. And they're ready to deal with the Americans as well, but the Americans have yet to learn the new expectations and new rules that make all agreements partial and temporary. So this non-hegemonic situation, I'm suggesting, is kind of more, not like our traditional ideas of great power politics, where there's a strong arm and a weaker arm, or a dominant coalition and a weaker coalition, but rather is something like negotiating coalition governments in Spain or Italy or France, or negotiating some kind of revolutionary transition like Sudan or Algeria or Tunisia. And that these are, in fact, the kinds of situations that we will see more and more often, rather than some effort to go back and revive the liberal institutional heaven of the post-World War II period, or the unipolar fantasy of the post-Soviet period. It appears to me that the three semi-great powers that are most important in having influence over our future are the West, China, and the Islamic world. And that all three of these potential rescuers of our fate are very deeply flawed. The West is an open book. You know, we have an idiot president, and that he is supported by something like 35 to 40% of the American public. You know that the United States is suffering from deep problems that go way beyond the personality of one person, and that there is a kind of double denial in American society. A denial of the eclipse of American power internationally, and I think also a denial of the rapidly changing socio-demographic balance, composition of the United States to becoming a predominantly non-white society and political system. As long as the United States struggles with those two realities and cannot accept, recognize them, let alone adapt to them creatively, positively, the United States is going to be a diminished actor in the international stage. With regard to China, the contradiction between opening and learning abroad and evading learning and reform at home is increasingly obvious, increasingly debilitating, and difficult to sustain for very long. The Islamic world, of course, is on two tracks, going in different directions. One track is very much a progressive and modernizing and increasingly open and creative group of societies. And the other track is a war against itself, especially resistance to authority that is very stubborn in terms of compromising or in terms of passing power on to younger generations or more open political groups. So the crisis of authority and legitimacy in all three of these societies is painfully obvious. And the role of political leaders is increasingly difficult because the older models that assumed popular acquiescence and acceptance of self-justifying power are gone. There is more and more demand for power sharing. And these demands for power sharing are not being met by commensurate experiments endorsed by those who hold power, but whose hold on power, whose grasp is increasingly tenuous. And I think that whatever the apparent differences between Western democracies, Chinese single-party rule, and the tumultuous democracies and the unruly dictatorships of the Islamic world, they share in common these fundamental flaws of authority that is no longer accepted as legitimate and that is under constant criticism and demand to justify itself. And the bases for justifying power are fewer and fewer. The idea that power can be supported in an inegalitarian environment or in an environment where censorship and state control is the norm, these expectations are no longer reasonable. I was in Guangzhou in August, and there was a very interesting conference. Well, it could have been an interesting conference. But it was supposed to be a UN-sponsored conference about political models in various civilizations. And unfortunately, the underlying theme seemed to be that democracy was in trouble everywhere, and the West had failed, and somebody had to come along and provide a new model. And why not the Chinese model? All we have to do is figure out what it is. And if you want to know what it is, all you have to do is ask the man on top and read his speeches and echo them wide and far. And the rest of the world will fall into line. The Chinese model is so self-evidently superior, and the Western democratic model is so self-evidently flawed that there really isn't a lot of debate here. My message to my friends in China was, you're asking for trouble. I said that if you think there is a Chinese model, that's wonderful. Then embrace it and perfect it. But don't for a moment delude yourselves into thinking that there's any market or demand for that outside of China. In fact, I wonder if there's any demand for it in China itself. And, you know, I said, we have a global standard of political life and legitimacy, methods of legitimizing authority that will earn buy-in from the majority of the people. And it's liberal democracy. It's elections. Now, we have discovered to our chagrin that most democratic systems in Europe and the United States and much of the rest of the world are not very democratic. But the solution for that, of course, is to make democracy more democratic rather than giving up on the whole idea and looking for something else. So Abraham Lincoln said that the notion of democracy was government of the people, for the people, and by the people. And I think that's still pretty much the brand, the coin of the realm. I would quibble with President Lincoln in that I would say the contemporary notion of democracy is much more direct and activist than that. That is to say, democracy by the people is most important. Of the people, for the people, yes, of course. But the idea is the people now are demanding more than ever constant and decisive involvement in all aspects of decision-making. The other thing that Abraham Lincoln said was that you can fool all of the people some of the time and some of the people all of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. This is his way of reassuring people that democracy could somehow overcome its flaws. Well, I think that has to be amended too. You can fool some of the people all of the time. I think that's still true. Donald Trump has proven that for a large segment of American society. But the idea that you can fool all of the people some of the time, I don't think is true anymore, or much more difficult. The level of education, of sophistication, access to information, the astuteness is much greater, especially among young people, educated people. And they, especially young women, are the ones who are leading these movements. I'm probably over time. I should say a little bit about global civil society, and that is that all of the social agitation and protest and organization that I have been describing, and that you see in the headline news every day, is adding up to something new and important. And that is the idea that there can be a global civil society. In other words, the old notion of international community, international society was built along nation states. It was the governments, the privileged power holders who would come together and make collective decisions depending upon their own hierarchy of power. But now I think there is another set of aspirations, and that is that there will be non-official, private, social movements around the world which will not be limited to their national borders or their immediate localities, and that women and students and workers and small business people and indigenous communities and environmental activists and human rights activists and so on can reach out to one another wherever they are in the world and draw attention to one another's demands and activities, and that this will add up to something that will be another center of power or centers of power that will be able to rival and check, if not supersede and replace, the existing network of nation states that we usually take for granted. So here's another idea that I am playing with. The notion of globalization is not simply a matter of nation states and big business, multinational corporations, but globalization happens from the bottom up as well. And the old split in our minds between global and local is passé, because the local tends to be subnational. But now the global one is being joined by and challenged by global two. So global from the top and global from the bottom are meeting, and their discussions are quite rancorous and contentious. A final point I can make is that global civil society is not going to create itself, and it's not going to arise automatically. That every effort to organize counter power itself produces new hierarchies and possibilities for domination and power struggles. So that if you look at the major movements and international conferences that present themselves as representative of global civil society, for example, the World Social Forum that began in Brazil and has met in all continents since then, what you see is that there's an effort to put together some movement of movements that has a recognized and permanent existence and some agreed representatives and policies and demands. And that this effort is stalled. It's very difficult to get going, in part because there's so much competition and suspicion among the rival contenders for control and advantage within these movements themselves. And some of the greatest differences are between Western and non-Western movements. So that if you look at women's rights movements, at environmental movements and human rights movements and labor movements, in particular, you will see that there is a huge north-south split in which the former colonial societies are determined that they will not be led by Europeans and North Americans, and that there will be some kind of collective approach. Okay, I'm awake now after my jet lag. Hopefully some of you are still too, so I think we can have questions if you wish.
Let's give Dr. Bianchi a round of applause. Thank you very much for the talk.